morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. And whoever's on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. I'm going to skip the introductions because we have so much that we really want to get to right away. And we are so fortunate today that we have Professor Adam Smith, who not only is a professor of architecture and of archaeology at Cornell, but also is a co-founder. It's Caucasus Heritage Watch, and he's going to tell us a little bit about that now. I'm trusting that all of you are going to read his bio, which is in the materials that you got for this meeting, and that I don't have to repeat all of that now because I don't want to eat into our discussion later on. So I love the words without further ado, Lucy, and I'm going to just hand this over to Adam Smith, Professor Adam Smith, who many of you are already familiar with. And he's going to give us an overview of what exactly Caucasus Heritage Watch is doing. Adam.
Great. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I wish I could be there with you in person. Apologies in advance if I suddenly freeze or something happens with the Zoom connection. The Wi-Fi seems a little bit itchy this morning. But what I'm here to do is to give you a short overview of the work that this organization, Caucasus Heritage Watch, that I co-founded with my colleagues, Lori Cacciadorian and Ian Lindsay, have been doing. I want to share my screen now at the moment. Can you all see that?
Yes.
The slide that I'm, okay, great. Okay, so I do want to emphasize that Caucasus Heritage Watch is a research collaboration. We work closely, the three primary directors, Lori, myself, and Ian Lindsay at Purdue University, founded the organization. We also have a very close relationship with Dr. Hussein Bulyan, who's been doing incredible, important research on our historic projects that we've been doing. We also have partners in Yerevan that we've been working closely with, such as Monument Watch and research on Armenian architecture that have been extremely important in the work that we do. So I want to acknowledge that, that this really is a collaborative effort. So Caucasus Heritage Watch was founded in late 2020 at the end of the Second Karabakh War, in recognition that the territories that were being ceded to Azerbaijan now faced an imminent threat to cultural heritage. Our project uses a technique known as heritage forensics that we're largely defining in the course of our labor as we go on, which applies technological and humanistic methods of research to assemble the kinds of evidence of heritage abuses of cultural remains that could be used in a court of law, or could be used by publics who might be seeking truth, reconciliation, and justice in the future. Our work currently has two primary angles. We have a program of historical research that is looking into what has happened to cultural heritage in the years between the First and Second Nagorno-Karabakh Wars. This involves two branches, one of which I'm going to talk to you about in more detail, and that is an investigation of the fate of Armenian cultural heritage in the province of Nakhchivan. The second, which is still underway, so I won't be able to say much more about that, is the analysis of Islamic cultural heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh during the years of Armenian administration. For our historical research, we use a number of different kinds of data sets, historical satellite imagery, particularly American spy imagery that has been declassified. We also use Soviet topographic maps and a range of other material media. For our monitoring mission, which is what we spend most of our days doing, we are tracking Armenian cultural heritage in the territory ceded to Azerbaijan by the terms of the 2020 ceasefire. This involves tasking new satellite imagery. We use Planet Labs SkySat constellation. This is the most expensive part of the program that we work on because we have to actually order the satellites to go where we want them, when we want them. This is a way of creating the image sets since, as you may know, the updates to Google Earth, for example, in different parts of the world are oftentimes very slow. And so it's difficult to actually get a real-time sense of what's happening to cultural heritage without actually sending the satellites on our own schedule. So let me talk about the historical research first. We just released a 430 some odd page report in September on the fate of Armenian monuments in Nakhchivan, which you can find on our website. And I want to give you just some highlights from that analysis. We used, as I said, some of the early ethnographic work that Professor Agam Ayvazyan did during his surveys of Nakhchivan, which were quite intrepid. It was very difficult in the Soviet period to travel through Nakhchivan, especially to show interest in Armenian cultural heritage monuments. We paired analysis of Soviet topographic maps and American reconnaissance imagery, such as you see here, in an unusual use of both Soviet and American Cold War material. So it was kind of a rapprochement of Cold War data sources. And primarily our satellite imagery comes from the Hexagon platform from the 1970s. We had a corpus of about 159 sites, of which we were able to locate 127. 32 of the sites were simply unlocatable. And we then did assessments based upon before and after imagery of satellites, taking the historic imagery and comparing it to more modern imagery. As you'll see, there were about 17 sites of our corpus that we could not make a determination based upon satellite imagery, but we were able to assess 110 different sites. And what we found was that of the 110 Armenian heritage monuments we could assess, 108 had been totally wiped off the face of the earth, complete obliteration. This is not just a case of roofs falling in or walls crumbling. This is erasure, and I will show you some of the images of it in a moment. These pie charts just give you a sense of the different categories of monuments that we were able to visualize and assess. What's interesting is the timing of this program of erasure. It's a relatively short window between 1997 and 2011 at the maximum. We used two different methods for assessing timing. One was if we had before and after images that could bracket, it's here and it's not here, we would use those. That was relatively unusual because the image coverage for the late 90s and early 2000s is very limited. We were able to use a second model called recency determination, where if we were looking at a site and we could see, say, spoil heaps still on the ground that hadn't been covered by vegetation or destruction still in process, we would be able to say that this was within the last 2 to 3 years that the event had taken place. But the sum total is that between 1997 and primarily 2009, most of those 108 sites had already been completely erased. So it's a relatively narrow time frame that we're talking about. Now, everybody knows probably about the case of Julfa, which is one of the reasons why we got into the historic monitoring, the historic assessment project. Simon Mahakian and Sarah Pickman have done extremely important preliminary research that detailed the destruction of Julfa and other areas like Agulis. It was their very important reporting that in large measure drove CHW to do a total assessment of what we could using satellite imagery across the entire territory of Nakhchivan. So Julfa gives you a good sense of the phasing of this. It's an enormous medieval cemetery, and it took many years to actually destroy. You can see the difficulty of the satellite imagery. One is we're working with monuments like churches and monasteries. You have a relatively strong satellite imprint in the archival sources. This gives you a sense this stippling on the ground is the stippling of khajkars and tombstones that you can pick up. We trained our eyes over time of the year of historic research to really be able to pick up these cemeteries. That was 1970, the 1980s, I believe, is that image. This is a 2003 image that shows you the destruction that's already underway. You can see bulldozer paths already being cleared through the tombstones all throughout the area. And by 2009, the site was completely gone. I want to stop this slideshow for a moment in order to show you some of the data from our report. Let's see. Here we go. Sorry, hold on a second. This is the one I want. Okay, this is our, we have an online ArcGIS story map called Silent Erasure that gives the full inventory of all of the sites of Nakhchivan that we were able to detect. Each site has a swipe, which we call it. Let me reload this here, which allows you to see before and after imagery for every single site. So you don't have to believe us, you can believe your own eyes. Here we go. This gives you the before image. This happens to be St. Hovannes Church in Tahuk. And then you can swipe left and you get the image of where it is, in this case, in 2009. Each monastery, church, and cemetery is accompanied, let me get to the story maps, with a story map.
Hang on.
That gives, can you see it now?
Wait a minute. Lucy? Yeah, I'm
Are
trying.
you able to see my screen?
No, hang on.
Oh, sorry.
Get it.
Oh, sorry. Here we go. It somehow unshared.
There we are. Okay, good.
There you are. Okay, let me start again then. So this is the story maps that I was telling you about. This is the webpage for Silent Erasure, our full report on the Nakhchivan materials. This is the swipe tool I was mentioning for each site. It gives you the before image. This is the Church of Chahuk, and the after image showing it's been erased. And then we have these for each individual site, which gives you a sense on where it is on the map, and also the individual entries. I want to show you a few just to give you a sense of what this looks like. So this is St. Shmabon Church of Agulis. This is one of the unusual sites where we actually caught imagery and the satellites data of the site in process of being destroyed. Let me see if I can reload it. Here you see. Here you see the church clearly visible in a 1973 US hexagon image. And here it is in 2000. This is quite early in the program of erasure. The church has been largely destroyed, but the foundations of the walls in the western area still seem to be intact. In a later image, this is all gone. There were a number of sites where we could actually see it in process where we had those early 2000 images. One of the unusual aspects of this program is it was not just confined to standing monuments. There were numerous cases in which ruins of churches that had been abandoned even during the Soviet period were then targeted for further erasure. These are the ruins of the Church of Nerkin Ankuzik or Ansur. And you can see here, we have a 2001 image where the ruins are still standing in largely the same state they were in 1973. This was an abandoned village. But in this case, and sometime before 2009, even though the ruins of the village were left standing, the ruins of the church were bulldozed. What's interesting also was what happens to most of the sites after erasure. In most cases, the sites of former Armenian cultural heritage are still vacant, even as late as the early 2020s. But in some cases, about 5 cases, there are reused for ecclesiastical or national structures. So let me give you a couple of samples. This is the famous St. Tovma Monastery in Agulis that Simon Mahakyan and CHW worked together on in documenting using satellite imagery. We've got a series of pairs here. So this is St. Tovma in 1973, still quite clearly standing. Here it is in 2000, where the interior church has been destroyed, but the surrounding walls of the monastery are still intact. This white part is a flaw in the satellite image. It's just a flare from something on the ground. And then we can take another pair of images. So here it is in 2009, territory has been entirely cleared. And then in 2014, a mosque was built on the site. This is a 2021 image, but the mosque opened in 2014, I believe it was. Perhaps the most garish of examples is the new Armenian cemetery of Nakhchivan. What was the new Armenian cemetery of Nakhchivan? You can see here this image. This is a very nice 1973 hexagon image. You can see again that stippled surface that I mentioned that's very typical of cemeteries in this part of the world when you look at them from the satellite view. By 2005, the area has been completely bulldozed. There's still a truck sitting on top of the former cemetery space. Now that former cemetery that you see here was then later subsequently turned into the Museum of the Azerbaijani Flag and Historical Monument. It's made into this enormous flag and flagpole. All of these are available on the Silent Erasure website. They're also available through our reports. We keep our report page very regularly updated. You can see we have it both in the 430-page version, which you're welcome to browse at your leisure, but we also have an abridged version that pulls out the main talking points that emerge from our research. Let me go back now to this so I can turn to the monitoring work. That's the second part of our project. So as I mentioned, we task satellite imaging regularly, usually 2 or 3 times a year at various different times to try and make sure that we're as unpredictable as possible. And we take, these are a set of areas of interest that we task. These areas can and do regularly change as we seek to get updates on different areas. We use a simple before and after method for detailing real threats and just damage and destruction to sites. We use those 3 categories of destroyed, damaged, and under threat as our primary classification tools for the materials we work with. This is the Surpyagisha Church in Sukwafushan or Matagis. You can see that this is a site where road construction has come very close to the door of the church. When we think that we can make a difference by raising concern and raising awareness, we use Twitter to then release findings as we have them so that we can hopefully deter damage to heritage sites, but at the very least, we can be sure to document the process of destruction. We keep a monitoring dashboard on our website as up to date as possible. This is where it is today. Based upon our summer monitoring, we have a fall monitoring program that's going on as we speak as well. So this will change in the coming few weeks. But it gives us a sense of both what we're monitoring and what its conditions are. And also, we're quite interested in if there are patterns in the kinds of impacts that we see over time. And then we have monitoring reporting as well. This was our most recent report that came out in October based upon a summer round of imagery. Overall, we have a series of concerns in Nagorno-Karabakh right now. The area of Shusha is certainly an area of great concern to CHW, since we have seen considerable impacts there, including a large number of damaged sites. We also very concerned about a corridor that's going through the Hadrut area that seems to have destroyed a couple of sites, but also has made others very highly threatened. We also, in this latest round, have a new area of concern up here in Lachin that has emerged as areas of undergone new kinds of development that threatens heritage sites. Let me give you some examples of the kinds of impacts we're seeing in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is the Shushi Northern Cemetery, which we reported on in 2021 as having suffered severe impact from the construction of a new building. This is the road that leads into Shushi here. And you can see some new structure has impacted this important cemetery. Under the category of destroyed heritage, some of you may have seen our work on the cemetery at Metz Taher, where road construction crews went out of their way to bulldoze this important 19th and 20th century cemetery. This is the area of the cemetery here. In the modern imagery note, you can see cemeteries much more clearly than you could in the 1973 imagery. You can actually make out areas of tombstones. But by April 9th, 2021, this whole area had been bulldozed. And you can see here the spoil heap from the bulldozing was used to elevate the roadbed. This is the cemetery at Sutnak that our friends at Monument Watch first raised the alarm on, and we were able to confirm using satellite imagery that it too had been bulldozed in the process of creating what appears to be a tunnel that's being created. This is a quite old cemetery from the 18th through 20th century. In the category of destroyed sites, we also have a significant finding from our summer work. This is the Church of St. Sarkis in Mohrenes. And here you see it standing in 2021 imagery. And in our July 6, 2022 image, you'll see that the entire village has been destroyed, including the church. One reason why we find this to be particularly significant is it's their first episode of complete destruction that we've documented since the decision of the International Court of Justice in the preliminary findings case. So the thought we had that maybe that decision might help deter heritage destruction that I think that we're still unsure if there is any deterrent effect that's we are seeing in fact on the ground. In the category of threatened heritage, I want to show you a number of just a few images here to give you a sense of what we take as threatened heritage. And to a certain extent, we consider all of the Armenian cultural monuments of Nagorno-Karabakh at risk. But our category of threatened really refers to an immediacy of the threat. That is, we see evidence of construction coming perilously close to a heritage site. At times, the threat may be of full bulldozing and being destroyed itself. At times, the threat might simply be that extensive construction materials and heavy equipment in close proximity to a cultural heritage site is never a good idea in terms of best practices of heritage preservation. So here you see the Church of Surp Asvatsatsin in Tagavard, where bulldozing has continued to get perilously close to the doorstep of the church. Oops, sorry. We see a similar pattern at the Church of Surp Asvatsatsin in Madatashen, where a process of bulldozing for road construction, again, slowly took out all of these buildings, and then last October took out this building as well, getting closer and closer to the piece of cultural heritage. You can see from the photo of this church that it's already in very fragile condition from the large crack that's running down. I believe this is the western wall. Okay. So what do we do with our work? One of the things that we are interested in doing is referring our findings, which are largely fact-based findings, to cultural heritage organizations, global cultural heritage organizations that we hope will make a difference. Amongst these are certainly UNESCO, which we refer our findings to. But the most important of these for our purposes has so far been the International Court of Justice, where our findings have been entered as evidence in the case Armenia v. Azerbaijan, and were part of the preliminary findings in that case last year. We also refer our reports to the State Department, where they've also been included as part of the 2021 report on international religious freedom in Azerbaijan, which I think was a useful set of materials for them as well. And let me then just wrap up by thanking all of the folks who make CHW's work possible. It's an expensive form of cultural heritage research because of the satellite tasking that's involved. But I do want to acknowledge the contributions of AGBU, the Aragats Foundation, which is our charitable wing, Cornell University, the Ford Foundation, Purdue University, and the Institute of Armenian Studies at USC as well. So I hope that was on time.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much. So our cultural heritage primarily that is being threatened is also our religious heritage. And our next speaker is Claire Evans. You're not going to see her, but you are going to hear her. And she is going to speak about her, her experience with the International Christian Concern. Claire has a particular interest in forced migration, which is after ethnic cleansing, it's the displacement of people. And that is the first part of this. And then we had Adam giving us the cultural erasure piece. So I think what we're going to do is, yes, you're going to focus on me here. We can get it to twist. There we go. All right. But Claire, why don't you speak into this microphone? There we go.
Well, you know, Adam, I've seen your research so many times, but every time I see it, I can't help but get a little more sad. It's just always so profound. But thank you all. It's good to see everyone, and good morning. I'm with International Christian Concern. We are an NGO based here in DC that has a specific focus on helping persecuted Christians worldwide. And we do that through what's called the 3 A's: awareness, assistance, and advocacy. And in particular, I focus on the assistance. I'm the senior assistance manager for the department, and I work on the humanitarian aid that we do worldwide. But my background's in advocacy. My background is actually in international religious freedom. So it all fits together really, really well. And I have to admit that I've been in this international religious freedom field for a decade, but it wasn't until 2020 that I even knew about Nagorno-Karabakh or Artsakh or anything like that. I have to confess I couldn't find it on the map. this was actually, I bring that up because there's actually a long history with ArtSoc in the international religious freedom community. And we just kind of have lost touch with that, I found. But hopefully, I really hope it can be intersected as the future goes forward. When the war against Nagorno-Karabakh first started, I was really only focusing on the Middle East, and I noticed something very strange actually happening. I noticed there's a lot of chatter in Syria. A lot of these terrorist groups were saying some very interesting things, and it was very much reminding me of what I saw in 2014 with ISIS. Actually, it was exactly the same thing. They were talking about how they're going to go destroy the churches, going to get rid of all the religious minorities. And I thought, well, I've seen this before. This doesn't look good. But there was something even more different, more complicated than in 2014, which was that these are Syrians going to Artak with Azerbaijan, with Turkey. What is happening? This is way more complicated than anything ever seen before. And it was just a few months after the signing of the ceasefire that, with the help of many individuals, some of whom are here in this room, that I and another colleague were able to go to Artak for the first time. And the purpose of this trip, it was basically fact-finding, and we were trying to answer two questions. The first was, is this really an international religious freedom issue? And if it is, then what kind of humanitarian aid should we pursue? And the outcome of this trip was published in the report Nagorno-Karabakh Humanitarian Perspective. And before going into the details of connecting the humanitarian work with advocacy, I just want to reflect for a moment on the question of whether the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh is indeed a religious freedom issue. And our conclusion from the trip was yes, definitely. But we walked away with an understanding about why that we didn't expect. And I just want to back up to the year 1998, actually, for a moment. That's the year the US passed the International Religious Freedom Act. It's Public Law 105-292. And this law is foundational for understanding today's framework of the international religious freedom space. It didn't necessarily define what international religious freedom is. It did affirm all the international instruments like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, but it didn't define anything in and of itself. It's sort of the implementing law for how we're going to follow these international instruments. It established within the US State Department an ambassador at large for international religious freedom. It created a special advisor position for international religious freedom on the National Security Council. And it created the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF. And we're going to walk through all of these in a little bit. But the unexpected discovery was this. Most of the NGOs and thought leaders who pushed for the creation of the International Religious Freedom Act, almost all of them had just a year or two before started working inside ArtSoc. They came right after the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, and it was that experience of doing that humanitarian aid which helped motivate them to create this framework that we utilize today in 2022. And for us, connecting these details, it was a huge discovery. This was not something we would have realized without going on the trip. Nobody talks about it now. Americans were not really a frequent presence in Artak, and people remember when we come, at least the non-Armenian ones of us, and they remember it very well. And so they were just telling us all these names from the 1990s. One of my colleagues, he said, it's like traveling down the road of our own history in the religious freedom environment. Well, 20 years later, something seems to have happened. The international religious freedom community kind of took on a life of its own, and so did the Armenian community, and both groups grew and matured. And at some point, though, along the way, the strategies just kind of stopped overlapping, and we kind of stopped knowing of each other's existence. And I really hope, when I think of the future, I really hope that once again, the strategies will come aligned, and that's the situation of ArtSoc can really help bring the international religious freedom community to the next level, because there are a lot of issues here that can really help us better do our work in this field. So speaking specifically on the humanitarian situation, one of the complexities of humanitarian work is that you have to personalize it, but you also have to data map all at the same time. And this can feel really contradictory at times. And then advocacy, to throw that into the mix. History doesn't matter so much with advocacy. It matters, but not as much as the present moment of politics. And that's something that always has to be considered. So it means that you have to hold in your hands absolutely everything you can with the humanitarian experience, and then knowing what to do with what and at what time. that can be really challenging. Credibility is very crucial within the humanitarian and advocacy space, and repetitive firsthand experience is a valuable tool for establishing that credibility, especially if that knowledge can be translated into the type of terminology of human rights language that we use. And that knowledge can be even more powerful if it's translated into an action item, which speaks to the political moment that whatever the audience is in is experiencing. So whenever we're working in the humanitarian space, a lot of information is just naturally collected. We go into the field, we meet the beneficiaries, we hear their testimonies, we feel all of their pain and their suffering, and that can really push us and give us momentum to move forward. And I especially remember when we visited, how many of the families we met were just in complete tears. Just so much uncertainty, and they were just plagued with this fear. I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. And now what do we do? Everything's gone. And I especially remember this one woman, she lived alone in this tiny temporary shelter. She had all sorts of food packages, but no one had actually thought to give her pots and pans. She didn't know how to cook it. And so we were able to see these gaps in the humanitarian aid that was being delivered. But we also noticed there's this massive inconvenience of movement. Nobody can just move easily. And we passed through a lot of checkpoints just to get into art stuff. Some were friendly, some were a little challenging. It was clear that outsiders were viewed with some kind of question mark. And that just really struck out to us because also the locals were not moving very easily. In the very least, they didn't have freedom of movement the way we would normally think of freedom of movement. And that's a huge problem. If you can't move, you can't really tell your story to the outside world very well. Third parties can't access it very well. And you need those things to be able to develop your advocacy and your humanitarian strategy. That said, we did have a really good trip, but the problem was now, how do you translate it back into DC? How do you get things moving here? And this is really, really challenging and still is the hardest challenge for us. Generally speaking, when you're trying to move humanitarian work into the advocacy space, you're going to really have to wrestle with one of three questions, or all three questions at once. And the first question is the composition of the audience, the group that I'm addressing, is that audience dependent on anything related to grassroots? And by that I mean elections. The second question is, what is the legal mandate which created the audience that I'm addressing? And then the third question is, what kind of authorizations are even in the hands of the audience that I'm talking to? And regarding the grassroots questions, this is actually one of the greatest strengths, I think, of the diaspora. We are a natural grassroots community, and a lot of groups don't have that there. Particularly when you're bringing issues to someone whose very position is dependent upon an election, the engagement of local communities in the US is very important. And the diaspora is that natural bridge to connect what's happening in the field to bringing it here home to us. And that's such a huge, huge driving factor for being able to do a lot of good advocacy work, is showing that it still matters here to us, not just over there, it matters here. And one of the key driving questions in the political space is, why should I act? Why do I do it now? Why not 10 years from now? Why not yesterday? Why should I act now? And so bringing in these human details, these testimonies, these firsthand observations, and bringing in the grassroots element really, really helps. But then the next question on legal mandates and authorization levels, I think this is where advocacy can get stuck quite often. The legislative branch has a very different legal mandate than the executive branch, which has in turn a very different mandate than a commission or a council. It's all just different. And this is where one has to really understand the international religious framework and the legislation that created it to really push the discussion into these types of issues. The International Religious Freedom Act, it didn't necessarily redefine any existing legal mandate, but it did expand and it did obligate different groups to do different things. So the US Congress, it basically has two functions which intersect with the Religious Freedom Act. The Senate chamber, it confirms ambassadors, it sets the tone for foreign policy, and the House chamber initiates the federal budget, which sets the tone for humanitarian assistance. The International Religious Freedom Act encourages that issues such as religious genocide are taken into consideration by Congress when both chambers engage in their activities. But the key is the NGO community has to be engaged. They're sort of the congressional watchdogs to make sure that all of this happens. And the International Religious Freedom Act is something that has to be reauthorized on a continual basis. And so if the NGO community is not pushing it, then Congress won't be pushing it. The International Religious Freedom Act, it did create 2 new entities for further engagement, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USERF, and the U.S. International Religious Freedom Office in the State Department, which is led by an International Religious Freedom Ambassador who's also confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Both of these entities release their own reports on an annual basis, and it basically draws upon the publications released by NGOs within the International Religious Freedom community. And if you want your work to be seen and hopefully cited by any of these entities, they need to know who you are. And for the most part, they don't really know the Armenian issues. The content of these reports are often used by Congress for budget determinations, foreign aid, foreign assistance. For example, a country might be penalized in their foreign assistance if the reports are not really a good reflection of the religious freedom situation there. Before effective engagement with any of these entities can be really seen as having any type of fruit, NGOs, they have to make a consistent and a very concentrated effort to show that the topic is indeed a religious freedom issue. And this is where it gets tricky because nobody's really defined it in the US legal sense. On one side, we can show that an entire history of the international religious freedom movement was born out of Nagorno-Karabakh. That establishes a precedent, but it doesn't automatically establish that what happened in 2020 and what's happening now is a religious freedom issue, and that's where we have to push hard and define it. ARTSOC is unique in a very important way when we look back up and we look at the wider religious freedom movement, which is that most countries that the IRF community works with, the Christians are the religious minority, not the religious majority. And so this is a very real thing that has to be navigated when talking with these communities. And I think that's where talking about the cultural heritage destruction, showing that there is a clear intent for manufactured demographic change, as well as collecting testimonies from the field, can really bring this home very strongly. But there's also another reason why ARTSOC is challenging for the religious freedom community. Most of the time, we're working on issues that are domestic to that particular country. So for example, ISIS was born in Iraq and Syria. The genocide happened in Iraq and Syria. With ARTSOC, you're talking about multiple countries getting involved and crossing national borders. We in the religious freedom community see that this is a growing trend. We don't know what to do about it. We don't know how to update the framework to address these issues. And that's why I think that ARTSOC today can really be another key player in moving the community forward. ARTSOC created the religious freedom framework back in the 1990s, and the struggles that ARTSOC is facing today can really help, I think, a lot of nations who are struggling with very similar things with the transnationalism aspect of religious freedom set a new tone. And that's why I'm really glad all of you are here. All of you are asking questions. All of you are engaged. We are on, I think, the cusp of redefining a new framework, but it's all thought leaders who are going to have to push it forward. So with that, I will close.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, so you've heard about our heritage erasure, which is primarily not just cultural heritage, but religious heritage from Adam. And you've heard about where we are in terms of what we need to do to be able to get on the radar screen of our legislators. We need to have our presence be felt. I'm going to quote a Margaret Mead quote. And what did she say? She said, "Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Now, I paraphrase that, but it's within all of us to be able to participate in even a small way in assisting both Adam and Claire in their initiatives to be able to move this ball forward. If we do nothing, we will lose everything that we have in ARTSOC. And right now, we've lost enough people and enough land. It would be a terrible shame to have the land that we've been on for over 2,000 years be completely erased of any indication that there were ever any Armenians there. And that's what we're facing right now, as you saw with what Adam was showing us. So I just want to encourage everybody to think about that for a minute. Now I'm going to open this up to questions. Does anybody have any questions for either Adam or Claire? Go ahead, Tali.
Thank you so much for, can you hear me? I don't know if
Can you hear her, Adam? No, now we lost Adam. He's muted. Adam's muted.
So maybe you can repeat.
I'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
Yeah, if you could repeat.
I think one question I have when dealing with, you know, the US government is how do you handle the political aspect of us? Because you want them not to focus on, well, you want them to focus on that, but when it comes to humanitarian issues or preservation or, you know, appropriations, you want them to think of the people before thinking about politics and letting the politics get in the way of helping or preserving. Or so how do you navigate that? You have examples in other situations where you had to deal with that issue.
The question is, how do you navigate the politics versus the desire to assist the people of Artsakh, because you don't want to get tripped up by the politics of it? Go ahead, Claire, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think any good advocacy strategy goes in 2-year increments because that's the election cycle. That also means that the staff you're working with can work in 2-year increments. So even if you can teach someone, you have 2 years to do it, and they may or may not be there afterwards. So you're constantly having to re-educate. And one of the things that I found very effective is bringing it back to policy as much as possible. A lot of these staff, at least on the congressional side, they aren't there for very long. They're not necessarily educated about caucuses or even the US policy towards that. But if you can know how does appropriations work better than they know how it works, like, you know, you make yourself an expert in those policy type details, then it becomes very valuable. I think, at least in the work that we've done, we found that a lot of staff are personally very, very motivated. They have no idea how to do it. They have no idea what mechanisms exist. They have no idea what the policies are of various things. So you almost have to make yourself extremely, extremely well educated and be prepared to repeat it every 2 years or less sometimes, and to really push hard that way. And we found that to be very effective. And even at least the work that we've done by pushing on the policy more than the politics and the mechanisms that are already in place that guarantee humanitarian aid can see results, not necessarily as fast or as much as we might want, but it's a slow needle to move, and you just have to slowly keep pushing.
Can I address that as well, very briefly? So what I want to emphasize is that Caucasus Heritage Watch is actually a nonpartisan organization. We are a research group that provides fact-based information in a often fact-free zone. So we try as best as we can to make sure that we don't take any political stance. We have no official position on the territorial questions surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh. Our role is to speak for monuments, is to speak for the places that cannot speak for themselves, and our larger goal is to get them off of the front lines of conflict. So conflicts may go, we're not trying to end conflict, but we're trying to get the cultural heritage off of the front lines.
Anybody else with a question back there?
So prior to the first Artsakh war, there were hundreds of thousands of Azeris living in Armenia proper. I imagine these Azeris also had cultural and religious monuments within Armenia. I'm wondering to what extent, if any, we monitor those sites and whether they've been preserved.
The question is, prior to the Artsakh war, there were Azeris living in Armenia proper, and they had their cultural heritage that might be in Armenia proper as well. Is there any work being done about monitoring the condition of the Azeri monuments in Armenia?
Thanks very much for that. That's a really good question. We are in the process of putting together another special report on the fate of Azerbaijani heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh during the years of Armenian administration. Our goal is to provide a fact-based complement to show the very different fate of those monuments between Armenian heritage in Nakhchivan and Islamic heritage in Nagorno-Karabakh. And we are not finished with that analysis yet, so it should be released in February. But I can say that what the evidence clearly shows is that there was not a program of systematic state-sponsored erasure as there was in Nakhchivan. There were failures of stewardship. And so there are issues that we will raise with the unrecognized Republic of Artsakh and its treatment of Azerbaijani heritage, but it's a failure of stewardship, not an active program of cultural erasure.
Anybody else? Yep, go ahead.
So for the erasure, has there been an attempt to track any statements or, well, I guess statements made by the Azerbaijani government that might evidence that there was, beyond just the fact that it happened, which is already strong enough, but is there an effort to try to find statements or publications or things of that sort that might further evidence that this was?
The question is about publications or statements made by the Azeri government that they had the intention of eradicating Armenian cultural heritage. Is there any sort of tracking involved with those statements and connecting it to what you're doing at?
So Simon Mahakyan is really the person who's been the most dogged in trying to track evidence from the governmental perspective archive. And so he's really the person to better answer that question. There is a telegram that he's published between the novelist Aylisli from Agulis, who was from Agulis, who was at the time in the representative body. And it was a telegram to Haydar Aliyev, and essentially noting that he'd heard of destruction going on in Agulis and that Aliyev should stop this from happening. And that was in 1997 or 1998. It's part of the reason why most analysts of the situation date the beginning of the destruction program to 1997 and 1998.
Greg, you had a question?
Yeah, a question for that. So it appears that most of the destruction of Javan took place after 1998. Is that correct?
Is it correct that most of the destruction of Nakhichevan happened after 1998?
Yeah, 1997 forward. 1997 to 2009 is the main window.
Is there any evidence that there was destruction taking place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
Is there any evidence that there was destruction in the 70s, 80s, and 90s?
There is evidence of destruction during the Soviet period that we know of. It's much more distended. It's not this sort of tight window of destruction like we see in the post-Soviet era, but it's a much longer term program that ended up with monuments in ruins. Part of it is part of the story of the slow migration of Armenians out of Nakhchivan, so that by the 1989 census, there were only 2,000 left prior to the outbreak of the Nagorno-Karabakh War. So there is not good satellite-based evidence for this. We have not done the full analysis of, say, very early satellite imagery, which would take us back to the 1960s at best, something like that. So anything that was destroyed before the 1960s, the evidence is primarily going to be put together through comparing old topographic maps, where a monastery that's, say, on one map in the 1920s is now no longer there in the 1930s, for example. But the evidentiary work to put together the material for that is a much more difficult and painstaking process, and would take a good amount of time, that's for sure.
Okay, Jake, go ahead.
This is for Claire. I noticed being in Artsakh this second time this year, increased aggressive cyber totalitarianism over the people in Artsakh, much more than jamming signal. So they monitor internet searches, email, frustrating a lot of communications. Now, this is similar to what communist China did in Hong Kong. And do you see a pattern now in the 21st century when you use the word persecution, that what's going on in Nigeria to ethnic and religious minorities in Congo and now in Artsakh? Is this kind of a unique, aggressive, totalitarian approach for IT, or is this now a new pattern of persecution in the 21st century?
No, it's definitely a new pattern of persecution. And this is something that we're noticing. This is where the religious freedom community needs to have more thought out, because there is a transnationalism aspect to it. And it makes it so much harder, even for the work that we do, because you do have countries like China or Azerbaijan coming in redefining jamming signals. You can't get anything out, and what you do get out, how do you know it's real? How do you know it hasn't been faked? How do you know even the pictures are genuine? How do you know anything? And so these are very real conversations that are having to happen within the religious freedom community. How we do with this? How do we know? And we don't have currently a framework that really can evaluate this, which is the challenge I think that we face with ArtSoc. But something that I think makes ArtSoc very unique is that you do have satellite photos. And I've not encountered that anywhere else in any of the countries that we've been working with. There's satellite photos that are very hard to deny. They're very easy to verify. And it shows very clearly where the trajectory is going. The tricky part is, and this is where we find the most difficulty in our conversations is, well, it's already done, so why keep going? They're already out, it's already destroyed, so why do I care about that particular area? And so that is a very challenging question to navigate. And then I think pulling in some of the more technological aspects, which is something we did when we came back from ArtSoc. We have a whole section on that in our report about how if you're not sending in third-party monitors, you can't even begin to figure this out. So you need to put people in there to really evaluate this, and it has to be third-party. You can't take anybody's word as it is. You have to send a third party in.
Okay, one more question. Go ahead.
You mentioned that you reflected your findings back to the State Department. What has been their response, number one, in light of their waiver of Section 907, which to me is a promotion of Armenophobia?
Well, State Department is always tricky. They don't tell you what they're thinking. They ask a lot of very hard questions, but they don't tell you what they're thinking. You kind of have to wait for it. So we have found it to be more effective to go on the congressional side, and from the congressional side, push State Department towards certain policies that we want them to achieve. We also have, there's a dynamic between the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and State Department, in that they both are looking at the exact same thing, but through two very different perspectives. USERF is authorized by Congress to basically do the same kind of reporting that State Department does, but from a whole different set of staff, whole different set of perspectives, whole different set of recommendations. So we do have a checks and balance system in place that allows you to push back on any of those entities, and utilizing that checks and balance system does help move things forward rather than just casting everything into one particular entity and leaving it there.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap this up because we do have another fascinating panel coming up. But before I do, I'm looking out and I'm just seeing an incredibly connected bunch of people. And I can't look out into the Zoom sphere and see who's watching, but I'm sure you're connected as well. We're all like 1 degree of separation away from somebody that we know that maybe is an elected official, maybe works at the State Department, maybe could help in some way. And I think it behooves us, since Adam has done such extraordinary work with Caucasus Heritage Watch, to call attention to this, to spread the word about this, not in the Armenian community. I'm talking about the non-Armenian community, the people who have possibly some ability to make some change. And the same thing with what Claire is doing. If there's something that we hear about, or if there's something that they are taking on as an initiative that we can amplify their efforts, let's just try to do that and make sure that the people that we do connect with that are non-Armenian, that maybe might care about this issue or informed about it. So that's all I have to say today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you to Adam and to Claire.
Thank you.
Taxes are covered.